And now a little story from the Appleseed.
The year was 1976, bicentennial celebration for the United States. And my dad, I grew up a preacher's kid. My dad was going to be candidate at Putney Bible Baptist Church. That meant that he was going to visit as a candidate pastor. He was going to preach a model sermon, and then after church, there would be a very serious business meeting and a vote by the membership to see if they wanted to issue an official call to have him be their full-time minister. Since it was 1976 and the bicentennial year, my mom dressed the entire family appropriately. I was wearing white alligator shoes. I had on bright red pants. I had a plaid jacket in red, white, and blue, my white shirt, and I had a bow tie that was so big it framed my entire face. I looked like a 4-foot Lawrence Welk. And then next to me was my sister. She was wearing a bright red dress with anklet socks. My mother had on a very conservative navy blue dress with a bright red kerchief around her neck, and my father was wearing a navy blue suit, but he had a red, white, and blue American flag tie. And as we got into the car to travel across the mountain from where we lived to Putney Bible Baptist Church, I grew up in the state of Kentucky, so everything's across the mountain one way or another where I grew up. When we got ready to go across the mountain, my mom put my sister and I in the back seat, and she said, "Be on your best behavior. We are going to church, and Daddy really needs this job." So we were threatened to be on the very best behavior. When we got to the church, my mom took us in, and we were shown around for just a little brief time. Then it was time for the service to start. And my mom sat with me and my sister, third row, right side. That's always where the pastor's wife sits. Third row, right side. She sat on the aisle. I sat in the pew next to my mom. Next to me was my sister. And next to my sister was her son, Tom Jr. Now, I was 6 years old. My sister was 4 years old, but she was already a mommy. When she was a little girl, you would ask her, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And she always said the same thing, "I want to be a mommy." By the time she was 10, she had 100 children because she was a doll collector. And she had all kinds of dolls. She didn't like Barbie dolls. She liked big, hard rubber baby dolls. So currently, she was the mother of Tom Jr. He was this big doll. He didn't do anything. His hair was painted on. His eyes didn't roll around in his head. He didn't go wet or anything like that. All he did was you could just grab him by the stiff legs and bend him out straight and stand him up, or then you could bend him and sit him down. That's all that he did. And he had a big hole in his right hand because we had accidentally closed his hand in the car door once, and it chopped all of his fingers off. And so she would just put Band-Aids over the holes and say, "Don't make fun of Tom Jr., he's handicapped." So she had Tom Jr. sitting next to her in the pew at Putney Bible Baptist Church, and she was a very good mommy. My dad, being a preacher, he knew the man who ran the local Bible bookstore, and he'd given him a sample New Testament. My dad had the store emboss Tom Jr.'s name in gold down on the front of the Bible, so she had that for Tom Jr. She had a diaper bag. We had a friend who was an obstetrics nurse, and she would give my sister all kinds of samples from the obstetrics unit at the hospital. She had bottles and little diapers for Tom Jr. She would sit there next to Tom Jr., open the Bible for him, point to the passage my dad was preaching from, hold the hymn book for him. And about halfway through my dad's sermon, my sister would poke that doll and say, "I said, be quiet." She was quite the show. Well, on this particular momentous occasion, my dad was preaching away, and I saw my sister bouncing in her seat, and I realized, oh, Tom Jr. has to go to the bathroom. Well, when we had been shown around the facilities just before the service, I noted where the bathrooms were located. It was a little country church, and you went down the aisle. In the back of the church, there was just the tiniest entry area, and in that space, there were 14 stairs that went way down to a basement. Then you walked back the entire length of the basement where there was a little one-holer tucked away basically right underneath the pulpit where my daddy was preaching. And my sister looked at me, and I whispered to her where the bathroom was, and she grabbed Tom Jr. by the hand, and not to disturb my mother, she just slipped out the opposite side of the pew and went out the back of the church, and I heard Tom Jr.'s head clunking on every step as she went down the 14 stairs into the basement, and then eventually I heard the door to the bathroom latch. There was a sign over the toilet in that little bathroom that had been hand-printed, and it said, "Do not flush during sermon." Because if you did, all the water rushing through the pipes, everybody knew exactly where you were. Well, she went in there, and I thought everything was taken care of. My sister has always been very independent, and she could handle herself in the bathroom, but she was only 4 years old, and she couldn't finish the paperwork. So all of a sudden, my mother didn't even see her leave. I guess it's mother's intuition. All of a sudden, my mother just turns and looks at me, and one eyebrow went up, and I could translate that meant, "Where is your sister?" Well, I was the pastor's son, so I just leaned over and quoted her a Bible verse. "All we like sheep have gone astray." My mom stood up because she knew something was about to happen, and she turned around and she started to walk out of the church. Now she's facing pretty much the entire congregation, and from down in the depths of the basement, we hear my sister yell out from underneath the pulpit, "Mommy, come wipe my tail!" My mother turns beet red, and she picks up her pace and she starts to walk to the back of the church, and then just in case anybody's wondering, she yells out, "I already wiped Tom Jr., he's fine." My mom went down the 14 stairs in the back of the church, walked the length of the basement, locked herself into the bathroom, and did not come out the rest of the service. When my dad had pronounced the amen, he took me by the hand, and we went downstairs and joined them in complete humiliation. We stayed down in the basement while the church conducted the business meeting. It was touch and go. It was about 50-50. But then a missionary lady who attended the church, her name was Helen Gemberling. I learned later that all the kids called her Miss Gem. She taught Sunday school there. She stood up and gave an impassioned speech on behalf of my father. She said, "Well, he preaches an excellent sermon, and he's proven that his children are normal. And so I vote that we call him as our pastor." And that tipped the balance, and they voted to call my dad to be the pastor of Putney Bible Baptist Church.
Thanks for joining us for a little story from the Appleseed.